Duplo Expresso.
Hi there, is the singer right? I'm Wellington Calazans and this is Duplo Expresso, your news program about the democracy situation in Brazil. We are beginning now on the Epna Kanolen. I'm talking from Stockholm, Sweden, and my co-host is Romulus Mayer, who speaks from Bern, the Swiss capital. Hello, Romulus. The face-off between Bolsonaro and Fernando Haddad is the hot topic in Brazil right now. What is going on in Brazil, Romulus?
Hi, Wellington. So, voting in the first round of the Brazilian election took place just last Sunday. But we kind of can see already how this is going to play out. As you mentioned, Wellington, we have a face-off between, on the one hand, the far-right candidate, Jair Bolsonaro, with a proto-fascist stance, and on the other side, we have Mr. Fernando Haddad in the left, with the Workers' Party, former President Lula's party. Mr. Jair Bolsonaro almost won in the first round last Sunday, just less than 4% short of the past mark of 50% of the Brazilian vote. Haddad, on the other hand, scored less than 30%, so almost 20 points behind Mr. Bolsonaro. The problem is that the left elected very few members of parliament, and even if Mr. Haddad from the Workers' Party fought very hard to win the election, a very unlikely outcome, prospects for a future government are quite bleak. The problem, and the further problem, I guess, is that Haddad does not seem to want to win at all. Brazilian society has become increasingly conservative with regard to so-called moral issues, that is, minority rights, women's rights, LGBT rights, and fighting against racial discrimination. But incredibly enough, that is precisely the reason why Jair Bolsonaro, a neo-fascist, became so popular. Oddly enough, that is, if Mr. Haddad actually wanted to win, he does not seem to focus on what could make Bolsonaro appeal less to the Brazilian masses, meaning his ultra-liberal stance with regards to economic and social issues, as well as his willingness to further deplete what is left of Brazilian sovereignty after the 2016 coup d'etat. Opposing those very projects was what made former President Lula and his Workers' Party, Haddad's party, win the last 4 general elections in Brazil in a row. And that's precisely what made him, former President Lula, the front runner in the presidential race up until 1 month ago, when his candidacy was prohibited by the judiciary. The judiciary constitutes an integral part of the coup d'etat group of conspirators. Former President Lula would have been elected in the first round himself. Haddad, who is far from being as popular or even as known throughout the country as former President Lula, is not standing for the agenda that made Lula win 4 times in a row. Instead, Mr. Fernando Haddad wants to make this election precisely about the so-called moral issues that make Mr. Bolsonaro, his opponent, so popular. Mr. Haddad even adopted as a slogan campaign that he is the representative of civilization against what he calls barbarism. When what he calls barbarism clearly became the norm in electors' preferences, rich and poor alike, not focusing on the consequences of Bolsonaro's ultraliberalism to the poor seems like a strategy aiming deliberately at losing. So again, as we have been saying throughout this process, this whole election is a travesty, a large fraud, with uncertainties even concerning the electronic voting system, which does not allow for a recount or even auditing Wellington.
Following the results of the first round of elections in Brazil, Brazilians living in Sweden are scheduling a meeting to form a resistance front against fascism. One of the persons in charge of Brasa, a group of Brazilian activists, Edgard Antunes Dias Batista, talks about it.
Yes, Wellington, we are preparing this manifestation, this act, with culture, against the fascism in Brazil. We are going to do here in Stockholm before the second round of the elections in the end of this month. And of course, this fascism, this candidate that is fascist, is a result of a series of attempts against the democracy in Brazil, against the constitution, and we have to protest in a way. And our way to do that is a cultural protest. And the idea is to get together with the Brazilians, those that are still not sure what is going on there and who to vote, to say that now the option is to vote in Haddad, because what we have, the option that we have, since the Lula, that was our candidate, is in jail and in another attempt against the democracy. Then we hope that at least this threat, this fascism, we can stop in the end of this month. Thank you very much. Thank you for Duplo Expresso for the opportunity, and I hope to see you probably on the 20th of October or 21st of October. We are still going to confirm the date and the venue, the place. But it must be before the second round that happens on the 28th. Thank you very much.
That was Mr. Edgard Antunes Dias Batista with the Brasa Group in Sweden. And now we'll have our legal correspondent, Ms. Maria Eduarda Freire, who will tell us a bit more about Brazilian's authoritarian and unequal justice system.
Good evening. Today, we are going to talk about the unequal and authoritarian Brazilian legal system. In the severely unequal Brazilian society, strictly divided in social classes, the penal system serves to maintain this inequality and reproduce it, as empirically shown in the prison population with more than 700,000 prisoners. Brazil is the third country with the biggest prison population after China and the United States. This prison population is basically formed by young, poor black men with low education levels who are accused of small thefts or the possession of a very small quantity of illegal drugs, crimes without violence or grave threat, not because these people correspond to the majority who committed offenses, but because they are selected, in fact chosen, not by their conduct, but because they are associated with a criminal stereotype taken from the characteristics of the poor population. The Brazilian justice system is enclosed by an authoritarian ideology of total despise to human rights, which is reproduced by arbitrary, illegal, or case-by-case sentences. This penal selectivity has always been conducted towards the poor, black residents of the slums. With the car wash operation, a new type of selectivity came by, intended to criminalize a political party, the Workers' Party, using corruption as a pretext, charges without proof, along with a monopolist media aiming at the exclusive goal of imprisoning the representative of the popular classes, ex-President Lula. The car wash operation seems to intend to criminalize politics. So far, it has used unconstitutional laws which reinforced the arbitrary power of the police agencies and plunged the rule of law of Brazil. The Supreme Court infringed the competence of the other Republican powers and acts as an extension of the punitive power of Operation Car Wash, going against the literality of the constitutional text, eliminating a patrial clause which ensures the fundamental right every citizen has, that is the presumption of innocence. So, it becomes easy to prove that when fundamental rights of the upper classes, in this case political groups, are mitigated, this will necessarily affect the lower classes, which is the target class of the penal selectivity. All of this contributes to the massive incarceration of young, poor, black residents of the slums.
Thank you, Maria Eduarda Freire. And now we'll receive Professor Ladislau Dowbor, one of Brazil's leading economists.
I am Ladislau Dowbor, economist, professor at the Catholic University of São Paulo, and I would give you some notice on the drama we're passing through presently in Brazil, a very polarized situation in a critical economic situation generated essentially by the financial system and by banks. It's curious enough because former President Dilma was sacked for an alleged budget deficit, which never happened. And actually, the mechanism is very interesting. It can be interesting also to understand other situations like Greece. Basically, if you go to buy a refrigerator, for example, and you will pay in installments, you will be paying in Brazil roughly 130% for a low inflation of 3.5%. I mean, this is absolutely absurd. If you go to a bank, they will be charging you roughly 150% for a loan. We have presently, in our population of 200 million inhabitants, roughly 65 million adults who are completely drawn by their debts and not allowed to make more debts. So you strangled the capacity of demand from the families, which is the main engine of the economy. And this has stalled the economic sector, the companies, the productive sector. Since there is no demand, it has been stalled, and this has raised enormously unemployment, which is over 13% presently. When you stall and limit the capacity of purchasing capacity of families, you reduce, obviously, taxes for government. And when the enterprise, the companies, the productive sector is also stalled, paralyzed, it is also paying less taxes, so you generate the budget deficit. So all this together, the very high interest rates on the public debt, the very high, the extremely high, this is usually on the families and on companies, on the productive sector, all these have led to enormous profit from the banks and other financial intermediaries, but has broken the economy. This you can find on my website, dowbor.org. You will find it in English, free of charge, a book called An Era of Unproductive Capital. The data are there, and it's good to understand how finance can strangle an economy.
Again, this was Professor Ladislau Dowbor, one of Brazil's leading economists. Thank you for joining us today here at Duplo Expresso at Etna Canolen.
Thank you very much, Romulus Maia. See you next week. Goodbye.
Duplo Expresso.